Hey everyone, this is Dawood from AutoMarketplace. Today we have the IDG team with us, the Independent Drivers Guild. So I'll let them introduce themselves.
Andrew, you want to go first?
Sure. Hi, I'm Andrew Greenblatt. I'm the Policy Director for the Independent Drivers Guild.
Hi, I'm Michelle Dotton. I am the Education Director, formerly Deactivation Coordinator here at IDG.
And I'm Brendan Sexton, I'm the President of the Independent Drivers Guild.
Perfect. Thanks a lot, guys. And thanks a lot for joining us. I know a lot of drivers follow you, are part of you. So let's start with just the basics. Can you give us a background to what the Independent Drivers Guild is, what IDG is, and how you started, when you started, kind of that sort of stuff?
Yeah. So first, I just want to thank you for having us on. We appreciate it. Appreciate all the stuff that you do for the drivers, getting out the information, diving deep into the subjects, into the weeds, and really getting the information out there for drivers that they need it. So we do appreciate that on your end.
Oh, damn. Thanks for the kind words.
Yeah, no worries. So the Independent Drivers Guild was born out of the International Association of Machinists. The machinists have been organizing black car drivers in New York City since the 1990s, and they had a monumental piece of legislation that passed in the turn of the century called the Black Car Fund, which developed workmen's compensation benefits for all the drivers in New York City. As Uber and Lyft entered the market, the driver population exploded. It was around 14,000 before Uber and Lyft. And then a couple of years into Uber and Lyft coming, it jumped to almost 140,000 drivers here in New York City. And with that, the machinists kind of figured out that they have to do more than they can. So they started organizing the Uber and Lyft drivers.
And what is it? What is the machinists union? Sorry for my ignorance. What is that organization?
Sure. So the Machinists Union is one of the most powerful unions in the country. They represent workers in all different industries. One of their biggest is Boeing right now, where they're on strike up in Washington. About 33,000 workers are on strike in Washington, trying to maintain and increase what their wages and benefits are. They also represent workers in NASA, where they build the spacesuits that go up into space. They represent the railroad workers. They represent workers in Disney World. So they represent workers all across different industries throughout the country. And they were founded in, I should know this, 1880 something.
Oh, that's okay. I'm not going to try to give you trivia on when a union's founded or anything like that. So IDG basically, if I'm understanding, and correct me if I'm wrong, it's obviously Uber and Lyft are kind of new inventions, or it's like a new technology. So by definition, a Uber union couldn't have existed, before the year 2011 or 2009, whenever it was started. So the origin story, because I know a lot of and I'm sure you hear this all the time, a lot of people are going to try to understand, okay, what is the genesis of the IDG? So is a way to summarize it is that there was an existing union called the Machinists, and then because there was no ability for independent contractors, drivers to organize, there was a structure in which Uber and Lyft drivers could organize by the Machinists Union. Is that a good way to put it?
Slightly different. So the Machinists founded the Independent Drivers Guild as a nonprofit advocacy organization to get drivers together to organize around the issues in the industry. Deactivation being one of the first ones that arose. Pay rates, IDG led the fight for the minimum pay here in New York City. That's been replicated in other areas across the country. And then also, as it evolved, social service benefits as well.
And that's really, so we're going to get into, oh, go ahead, Andrew, go ahead.
So from the beginning, so you talked about independent contractor status and the ability to form a union. So that issue is very specific to a union, has to do with the federal law. So there's a federal law, the National Labor Relations Act, that says who can form a union and who can't form a union. And that law is kind of run by the National Labor Relations Board, and their chief counsel has said these drivers, Uber and Lyft drivers, cannot form a union under federal law. And so one of IDG's central missions from day one was to figure out a way around that. These drivers need a union, a real union. And so when I was brought aboard, that was my number one task, was figure out, if the federal government's not going to give these workers the right to form a union, how can we do it? And we did. We figured out another way around it using state law. And right now, on election day in Massachusetts, the fruit of all that labor is on the ballot. And so Massachusetts drivers are going to have the chance, if we can pass this on election day, to be the first Uber and Lyft drivers in America to actually form a real union under state law. And that's why this was started by the machinists. So the original idea was, look, the federal government says we can't form a union. So let's do as many things for drivers as we can, organizing them around pay, around benefits, around all those kinds of things we can, deactivations and so on, from day one. So let's start making their lives better right away. But as soon as we can figure this out, what these drivers really need is a union. And that's been what's been driving our efforts from the beginning.
And that's super interesting. But what Brendan, you said, what Andrew, you're saying is super interesting. So is the Massachusetts ballot a result of ID? It kind of leads into the next question, where how big is IDG? Is it just a New York City thing? Is it across the country? Is that Massachusetts ballot from IDGs? I think, correct me if I'm wrong, I'll let you answer the question, but isn't IDG national and it's kind of behind that ballot? Or I could be wrong about that.
You're asking two different questions here. One is how big is IDG? We'll talk about that in a second. The second is, are we behind the ballot? The answer is, we were the people who came up with the ideas, but we handed it back to the machinists. Right. So in Massachusetts, IDG is not working on the ballot proposal directly. As a 501c3, we try to avoid direct electoral politics like that. But the machinists created us to be the think tank to figure this out. And then when we did, we handed it back to them. And so what's happening in Massachusetts is actually a partnership between two unions, the machinists and SEIU's local 32BJ. And so those two unions together are working together to get this done. But the idea came from work that we had done here in-house at IDG and then handed back to them, which was always the idea.
That's amazing. And sorry if I came, that was meant as a compliment, as in terms of like, you guys are making enough progress where these initiatives are kind of bearing fruit, and we're living in a world where there's more gig work. I mean, you know this, I'm preaching to the choir, where there's a kind of a new paradigm, if you will, in terms of the amount of gig workers there. So diving into New York City, and I'll let you, I did the same thing with another guest from kind of another advocacy group, where the number one thing where our readers say is that, well, IDG is funded by XYZ, fill in the blanks, the complaints. How would you address how IDG is funded? And even if and let me help you, let me be fair, because you know where this is going. Obviously, like, one way to view it, and this is coming from me, not from you, where let's say on a deactivation appeal, you want Uber to be paying for the deactivation appeal. So if Uber is giving money to the IDG to process deactivation, yes, the money's coming from Uber, but it's to say that's funded by Uber is not intellectually, it's a more complicated thing. So how do you, I'm sure you've asked this question by a lot of members all the time. How do you answer that question in terms of funding, in terms of all of that? I'll leave it to you.
Yeah, thanks. And I appreciate the way that you framed the question. But I do want to say that we actually don't get a lot of questions from members about that, or TLC drivers. That kind of line of attack was originated by the medallion owners when the machinists first started to organize around deactivation in early 2016. And they were able to, with the help of drivers and organizing committees, get deactivation processes put in place. So any driver it was first started with Uber and then Lyft followed after, that any driver that's deactivated has a chance to appeal that deactivation with an advocate and a third-party arbitrator. So most drivers do not see IDG like that, but it's been a consistent attack from the medallion owners.
Fair, no, I think that's a fair answer. And you're basically saying that I think, and I'm trying to combine multiple points here. And Michelle, I want to talk about more the driver deactivations, getting into, I know you were leading that effort. With what you're basically saying is that because, and to Andrew's point, Uber and Lyft drivers could not organize under federal law. There it's kind of like the roundabout ways that have to be figured out on how to do this. And so, okay, now getting into.
I'd like to make two points here.
No, for sure, please.
Sorry. So the first is this is one piece of what IDG does. So your broad question was, where does our money come from? And the question is lots of places. So it depends on the program you're talking about. So for example, we run a mental health program, and that program is funded with a small surcharge on every trip. And because of a law that I wrote that gives workers all sorts of benefits, free eyeglasses, free dental, free mental health, free financial counseling, all that stuff is paid for with a 0.5% surcharge that your passengers pay so that you can get access to those free things. We run some of those programs, and so those programs are funded that way. We run a deactivation program, and early on we had to figure out, well, who should pay for that? So if you're gonna have arbitrators, if you're gonna have advocates who speak your language, who understand how to do this, who come to work every day, and their job is to get you back to work, someone's gotta pay them. And so we could have thought, well, we'll bill the drivers, right? They just lost their job, they don't have any money, let's send them a bill. Like, that doesn't make any sense. So instead, the machinist union was able to muscle the companies into saying, look, this is a problem that you're creating, you should pay for these drivers to have the advocates they need. So that's a program that we run that Uber and Lyft pay for.
That's, I think between the both of it, I think there's no more detail you can really give. I think you've given a very full answer to that question. So, okay, so getting Michelle involved in terms of.
I just want to mention one thing that Andrew had said, particularly about the mental health program, because it really is something that's important. There was a rash of suicides that I'm sure you were aware of that happened in 2017, 2018. And instead of just sitting there doing press conferences about it, we hit the streets and got to work with the drivers, and in particular with the Black Car Fund, who was very instrumental in getting the 0.5% and the grant monies that we can actually launch a mental health program where we have 8 social workers on staff, we have 10 driver advocates, we have 4 or 5 community mental health organizers that are going into the communities and destigmatizing mental health and bringing people into the program. And it's just, what we often find is it's the financial burdens that move people into these states, but there are also outside factors that financial burdens also help with housing, with car loans, all these other things, deactivation. So our social workers have a holistic approach to helping these drivers. It's just not, tell me about your feelings. It's about, okay, let's get to the core of it and how can we find different services throughout the city and state to help alleviate some of these issues that can help alleviate the financial burden.
I should ask, how many people are on, I should have asked that, how many people are on IDG staff in New York? How many staff members do you have?
Now you're gonna make me count.
Okay, there's a lot, basically.
No, it's actually not a lot.
Yeah, but it's probably about 20, 25.
Yeah, it's a couple of dozen.
Okay, it's an organization. It's an organization for sure. And just to give readers context, and you're referring to the Black Car Fund, some of that money coming from the Black Car Fund, where that's a 3%. Andrew, you've already mentioned that. Just for our viewers who might not know the technicalities, it's a 3% surcharge. It's like a workers' comp. It provides various benefits, and we're going to get into the various benefits. We'll start out with deactivation because there's as you guys well know, there's a city council bill on the table. There's a lot of, and deactivation is a national thing. So I think this discussion will actually get national traction. And I think, as always, a lot of national discussions originate from what happens in New York City. And so I guess let's start out with let's kind of go revert. Let's start out with like a bill, like Intro 276, I think it's called.
Yes.
How would you, I don't want to frame that. How would you frame the bill? Why are you against it? Because I think a lot of people will be like, well, why would IDG be against a driver deactivation bill? And with these things, there's obviously a lot more complexity to these stories than what is said. So let's start there. What is Intro 276 in your eyes, and why is IDG against it? And we'll start from there, and then we'll talk about the IDG. Michelle, I definitely want you to get you in because I know you led the driver deactivation thing. And how does IDG currently help drivers get reactivated if possible? I know that's like 3 questions, but attack that as you will.
I'll talk about first.
Let's start with Intro 276, and then we'll move into
Right.
what we've been doing.
So let's start with where it came from, then we'll talk about what it does, and then once you see what it does, it'll be clear why we're against it. So it came from, again, from the medallion owners. So the medallion owners have a trade association, the Taxi Workers Alliance, and they make their money by driving their cars. So about 20% of medallions are owned by people who drive their cars. And then all medallion owners, including the ones who drive their own cars, rent out their medallions if they can for $165 for a 12-hour shift, right? And so they can only do that if drivers are desperate enough to take that deal, because that deal isn't as good a deal as owning your own car and driving for Uber and Lyft. And so they are desperate to find ways to get drivers with TLC licenses who can't drive for Uber and Lyft for some reason, and they're forced to rent yellow cabs. So their effort here is to undermine the deactivation process that IDG has, because we get drivers back to work. And if they can make it so we can't get drivers back to work, those drivers are going to have to rent the medallions. Now, the way they did that was with Intro 276. So the first thing you got to understand is, why do people get deactivated? So a guy from Uber testified at the hearing, you may have seen it, and he said that 99% of the deactivations are actually not from Uber or Lyft. It's because TLC says you can't drive anymore because you haven't turned in some paperwork, you didn't get your drug test, you didn't do something you needed to do, and then you're taken off the list, and then you can't be dispatched. Most people solve that problem for themselves, right? They figure it out. It's like, oh, I gotta but enough of that 99% can't figure it out because of language issues, because the literacy questions or whatever, that they end up coming to us because they can't work and they don't understand why and what to do about it. That, and also people who their ratings drop, right? So if your ratings drop below 4.75, you get deactivated. So those are people who need professional training. And we run a course for those people. We call it the 5-star course, so you can raise your ratings to 5 stars. And we teach people how to be better drivers and get them back on the road in less than a week. And so those 2 cases, people who have just some kind of paperwork snafu or whatever, and people whose ratings have dropped, that's more than half the people who come into our office, and we can get them back to work within a week or 2 at the most. Now, what Intro 276 does is it sets up a completely different system. And it says, look, what we're going to do is have a city agency determine whether or not you've been deactivated for cause, that's the legal term, meaning for a reason. Did the companies have a good reason, or did they mess up? Now, if you haven't put in your paperwork or your ratings have dropped, and again, that's more than half the people we serve, that is for cause. And then in those cases, the city agency will say, yeah, that was for cause. Next. Oh, you're out of work, too bad. There's nothing in the law that helps, again, more than half the people who come into the office. Now, the rest of the people get deactivated, have some problem, and I know you've heard the stories, people make up all kinds of crazy stuff about drivers. Sometimes it's they want a refund, so it's a free ride. Sometimes they're just mad because they're late for their flight and the driver won't speed. Sometimes it's just racism, right? There are enough racists in America that if you're driving 1,000 people, a month, you're gonna get 1 or 2 or 3, and they're gonna make up some crap about you. And so those are cases which for us go to arbitration if they have to, if we can't just convince the companies, it goes to a third-party arbitrator. Not the company decides, it's a third-party arbitrator in a workers' panel. So that's a panel of drivers who get to make that decision. Now, under Intro 276, there's also a chance for arbitration, and in fact, the companies can force you into that by having you agree to arbitration ahead of time. When you log on and it says, do you agree to the terms and conditions? They could just bury it in there. In fact, there's a whole thing about like, if you agree ahead of time, you're not gonna take your job back, they don't have to give you your job back. They can bury that in the terms and conditions. So even if you win your case, you don't get your job back. Like this is all kinds of stuff that undermine the whole process and means more and more drivers are gonna end up out of work, desperate, needing to rent yellow cabs for $165 for every 12 hours. So like, no, that's not what this should be. Like a union negotiated a system that actually reflects what drivers need. More than half the drivers need either professional development or help getting through the bureaucracy. That's what we give those drivers. The rest of the drivers need somebody who's a strong advocate on their side. None of that's in Intro 276. You don't get an advocate. You have to figure out the whole thing yourself. You have to defend yourself, forget language issues, like none of that's in there. We, as a work organization as close to the drivers, know what drivers really need, and that's what we give them. And instead, what Intro 276 is just like lots of pretty words that if you really know how it's gonna work, and we do because we do these things, just means more workers out of work.
Can I ask you a follow-up question on Intro 2? Would it eliminate the ability of IDG to run that process? Like if it was passed, it would impact you in some way. Or IDG, not you, IDG's process, I would say.
So there's nothing in it that says IDG process must go away. Instead, what it is it says to the companies, this is the process that exists now in New York City. And so like if the city is handing you something that's easier, cheaper, you're in more control and says this is now the official process, why would you consider?
Oh, that's it. I see what you're saying. You're basically saying that it almost like they'll say we're not going to fund IDG's deactivation process and arbitration panel because the city already created another thing. So basically, it's significantly weak. It might not make it illegal to have IDG's deactivation process, but it basically significantly weakens it. That's the issue basically?
Well, it just means it would go away. There's lots of things that aren't illegal for companies to do that they don't do if it's more expensive than just not doing it, right? Mm-hmm. I think of all the things companies could do to make the world a better place, that if the government says, well, we're going to take this over, you don't have to do it anymore, why would they keep putting money?
On that point, if this is passed, because there's, and I know you guys were at City Council, we did a summary of the City Council hearing. I know there was, you guys decided not to speak at that hearing as a form of protest, from my understanding. Your fear is that if this passes, that Uber will just say, okay, IDG, I know we had an arbitration process with you, but the city created something else, so therefore we don't got to provide you any money. Is that a way to frame it for people?
No, I would say our biggest fear is that the drivers will be disenfranchised, and thousands and thousands and thousands of drivers will lose their livelihood. And not only their livelihood, but it could also mean losing their homes. It could mean not living in New York City anymore. It could mean going into bankruptcy, going into poverty. That's our biggest fear and concern.
Understood. So Michelle, now it's your time to shine. Now we're going to have you talk for a bit. So you've led.
I gotta turn this so she's nice and centered here.
You've led the, and correct me if I'm wrong, you've led the deactivation appeals process. Can you give us some maybe you don't have the numbers, maybe that's an unfair question, but what's the success rate been like, or how have you helped drive? Like, how many drivers are you seeing like a week or a month, would you say, on this, and how do you help them?
Well, we started this 10 years ago. When I first started driving, one of the main cores of me even joining with IDG is the fact that I was deactivated for about a weekend because someone said I was smoking marijuana. Now, If anybody knows me, I don't smoke. So that was number one. But because I can advocate, I come from a background of corporate America, so I know how to speak for myself. And I marched into Uber's office and I said, really? You had 26 drivers. The last driver, I didn't even have a couple of seconds in between the drop off to pick up. When did I have time to, smoke marijuana, right? I realized that there was something going on. And as I was approached and I started looking at what's happening between Uber and the drivers and how they first started the pay just started to drop, I was like, okay, there's something happening here. And I have always been an advocate for drivers. So one, Intro 276 is a personal affront to me and to my integrity and to what I believe. And my first and foremost thing is to represent drivers because I am one. I still hold a TLC license. And when a driver sits in our office, he's not just a stranger, because with that driver comes every issue of his family. We take our responsibility home with us. When we leave here, we're contacted by drivers every hour of the day because they don't work our shifts, right? 2 a.m. And when you ask if we have a big staff, no, we don't when it comes to the process that we do. But what we do is care for each driver that walk in the door like their own family. Why? Because them not being able to feed their families is something that hurts us tremendously. And we always look at the fact, how can we fight for a driver's right to get back on the platform? And for 10 years, I have been doing that. And when this bill came out, I was like, that just acts like we don't exist. But the thing about that is, you knew that there was a process. You created a bill when you already knew there was a process. So this bill started off with a lie, 100% lie. Now, can we put every driver back on the platform? Absolutely not. And the reason I say that is we have to be fair. There are good drivers and there are bad drivers. There are drivers that can get a second chance and be rehabilitated and understand what their issue was, especially why we have created the 5-star class to teach drivers what they really need to know. And again, culturally, right? Some things are not as important because in the culture, it may not matter. But to somebody who's paying to sit in your car, it does matter.
Can I ask you, but everything you just said makes a lot of sense. And it's interesting that you actually were deactivated yourself. So it's not even a conceptual thing to you.
Exactly.
But why is Uber against Intro 276? Because at their hearing, they seem to be against Intro 276. Is that because working with IDG, they already have a process, everything is working as it should be? Or is that like totally unrelated, or they just want to be regulated?
Yes.
Yeah, you'd have to
we'd
ask
have to
them.
ask them on that.
Yeah,
Right? We can ask you. What we can tell you is that when a driver comes into our office, we will sit with them somewhere of half an hour to an hour, sometimes hours, depending on what they have going on, right? And it takes a lot of legwork to actually find out what was going on between them and Uber in their accounts, and going through their phones. Before we even create the case, we find the history of what's happening. And the thing about it is, when we become independent contractors, we're not given the tools of how to succeed. We're just told by a friend, this is a great job to do. But they're never told the pitfalls of this job, right? And so if you've ever driven as a driver, you'll understand that each person is different in the car and each expectation is different, right? So we look at our main goal is to get back the drivers that deserve to be driving. We represent everyone. And we also look at the fact that if let's say you're sitting in back of the car, right? And you're driving and that driver is driving reckless. Will you want that driver on the road? Would you? in the-
Absolutely. I mean, no, not for me
Okay,
personally. I would
so,
not want
all
that
right.
driver on the road.
So we rehabilitate them in the sense of their behaviors on the road. So when they come in, it's not just, can I get my account back? It's that, okay, how can I make you a better driver when you get back on the road? How can we improve your understanding of the industry? Because that's a huge part of why there's failure in.
It's interesting you say this is kind of reminding me, I started this industry and more in like the Uber Black space, like that luxury segment. And so like it's kind of like chauffeur classes, like if you want to work for like, drive celebrities or really rich people around, like they got to train you on, how to pick them up and how to do, all of that stuff. So I definitely want to talk about, lockouts as our next topic, which is equally as interesting as deactivations, but to kind of put a wrap on deactivations and whoever wants to answer this, or everybody can answer this if you want to, is that what I'm hearing is that Intro 276 in a very simplistic way will negatively impact a process IDG has been running for, I guess, a decade. And if it passes, it will impact the existing process, which appears to be working for a fair amount of drivers and would reverse kind of a win you guys got by creating a deactivation appeals process. Is that a fair way to summarize it?
You're focusing on the wrong thing. If Intro 276 passes, more drivers will be out of work. That's what matters. Like the rest is all inside baseball and who won what. None of that matters. What matters is there are men and women out there who feed their families, pay their rent, and pay their car payments by working. And if Intro 276 passes, more of them will be thrown out of work unfairly with nobody to help them. That's the bottom line. Everything else is, doesn't matter. Yeah, it doesn't matter.
Because have you ever gone for government services? Have you ever had to go on a welfare or social security office for help? Have you
Not
ever
for benefits help, but to get like a social security card or something like that. But yes.
Okay. So can you imagine a driver going in through that bureaucracy to tell them, I didn't do this, I need your help? Because right now we scream about even going to the DMV for getting help. That should be easy, right? When we have people who have gone in, at a low point in my life, I went to a government agency to get like a SNAP loan, right? And I was told by that agency, because I made the money that I made, I couldn't get the loan because they're not sure I would pay it back. However, they will give it to a low income that doesn't have a job and will never be paying it back. So this is, when you look at that, this is sort of like the process, a driver going in and spilling their life to a person who's just there for a paycheck, right? It doesn't matter. They have no skin in the game. They have no need to put that driver back on because it's not really their issue. They're just doing a job, and it's a government process. Whereas it matters to us because we're drivers. We want that driver back on the road. We want to make sure that the family, when a driver gets back on and he comes into the office, he'll bring us sweets. We should be like, how many pounds bigger, right?
You're like kind of saying like your advocacy is like, for you, it's not like at the DMV, the person is renewing, like, let's say there's an administrative state, like the guy or woman or however they identify is getting paid a salary. For them, it's not like in their bones. They're like, whatever, like, okay, you got deactivated. Okay, we know the process. You're saying as a driver advocacy organization, as Michelle, in your case, you've actually lived that, it's kind of visceral almost. Where it's like you're not only doing it for the money. For you, it's kind of like personal. It's like, we're advocating because we want, obviously, like you said, not every single driver is going to qualify for reactivation. But you're saying like, why give it to the DMV kind of thing? Like you're going to give deactivations to the DMV. And Andrew, to your point, and also what Brendan was saying, is that ultimately this is all semantics in terms of this law and that law and all of that stuff. Your fear fundamentally is that if you make it bureaucratic, more drivers are going to be permanently deactivated with a lesser probability of getting reactivated? Is that a good way to kind of?
I mean, just the whole system is set up around, so the legal term is adjudicatory, right? So what the law would do is it would create a system where it says, first, the only thing you have to figure out is were they unfairly deactivated. And as I said earlier, more than half the people were technically fairly deactivated. We want to get those people back to work. They're not bad people, they're not bad drivers, they just didn't turn in some paperwork, or their ratings went down because often it's cultural differences. The best example I heard from an instructor once was there are cultures around the world where you don't touch your passenger's luggage because they will be like, hey, you stealing what are you doing? Hey. Well, then they come to America, they don't touch your luggage because that's the polite thing to do. It turns out in America, people expect help getting their luggage into the trunk. So just, these are just things that drivers need to learn when they start working in our market. We can teach them those things and they will be excellent drivers.
That makes a lot of sense. One last point on deactivations, then we'll move on to lockouts. And by the way, I love talking about these things. So maybe let's say what happens to Intro 276, whether it comes to pass or not. But one very specific thing I'm just remembering on deactivations, service animals. So I know a lot of people have reached out to us about service animals. If someone gets deactivated from service animals, is that kind of like a hard thing to recover from? I know it's a very specific question, but maybe you ran into it.
Sure. So actually, we were able to, with a lot of fighting and a lot of thing, get Uber to reconsider service animal refusal based on at least one shot, right? And the reason that is because of the ADA rules. And Uber can be charged as much as $10,000 for a real service refusal. But in the rules of TLC, there's nothing a driver can ask, really, that a rider has to answer. Are you certified? What is this animal used for? If they ask, already the rider is upset. Because here you are refusing their pet or their service animal. And if we look at more than 90% of service refusal were pets. But because of the way that the rules are written in TLC, it is not on the driver's side. And what we fight for is fairness and understanding that this was something, the way the rules were written was unfairly burdened on the drivers. And so we were able to get Uber to relook at that, even with the possibility of a $10,000 fine from ADA if they are legally have a service animal and can be reported.
I think that's the best answer I've ever heard to that question that I've ever, that's the most you can't answer that question any better than you just answered that. And to wrap up driver deactivations, what is the website or a place where drivers can go to reach out to IDG on deactivations?
So before we get to that, one big thing that people get deactivated for, and you heard Michelle say that she got deactivated for was drug use. We have a lot of drivers that have religious observances that do not partake in recreational use of drugs. And actually, Michelle spearheaded this a couple of years ago, that if there's a drug use complaint, the driver has the right to a drug test that the companies pay for. And when that drug test comes back, they get put back on the platform. And we used to fight about this because there was no viable way to prove that they weren't using drugs, right, without a drug test. And Michelle spearheaded this a couple of years ago, and we've gotten hundreds, if not thousands, of drivers back on the road within 24 hours of
That's actually such a good point. I mean, by the way, amazing job with that. I know people who've been deactivated because someone said they were drunk, and then I talked to that person and I've never drank alcohol in my life type of thing. So. Yeah, exactly. So, okay. And so now before we get into a lockouts discussion, so just on deactivation to conclude this discussion, how do people, I think there's a website, imdeactivated.com or .org is
Correct.
.com?
Yes. .com.
Okay, and we'll provide a links to everything in the description. So if you're deactivated, if you're a driver out there, reach out to IDG, take a swing at it. And I just want to be fair to you guys, like, it's not a guarantee you're gonna get reactivated, but at least, reach out to them. Exactly.
We take it to the wire. We not only fight, we dispute. And one of the other things that we worry about a government process, there will be no dispute. There will be no way to say, but you say this, but now we have the evidence that that's not the case. In a government process, once it's closed, it's closed. There's no going back. And so we have to look at that option also. And some of the hardest fights I've had, and when I tell you, you go to a driver and say, why? Why does she continue fighting? Because I believed in that driver. And I believed in his right and his honesty. And I want to make sure that comes across. Every organizer here fights to the wire. You remember the article where the young man was deactivated? It was in the, I think, Daily News. They were charging him with being part of a gang of drivers who were stealing vehicles. And no one could help that driver. No one. And one of our people, Maura, called us and says, can you see if you can help this driver? When he came in, we looked at his case. We said, wait a minute, he's vindicated by the court of law. So why is he not able to get back on? And so we contact Uber, we push through. In some cases, we just go straight to who we have to go to, right? Because if we believe strongly enough, we don't even wait, right? We don't go through the general process. We'll go through a separate process. Because this is a driver's right by court of law. If you're vindicated, then Uber and Lyft have to vindicate you too. And so we look at all of those things. There are many things that come through this door that's not the average. And so we look at it separately, individually. Each person's individual case. We're not lumping you together all in one process.
Honestly, that's a great way to conclude on the deactivation topic. And, thank you for really, I think that's going to be very helpful to a lot of drivers that this is IDG's exact perspective. Okay, moving on to lockouts, a topic that has been discussed in public hearings, a topic that, is just this thing. This is how I'm going to frame it. So Uber and Lyft obviously are using, I think this is uncontroversial to say, they're using a loophole, whether it's legal, illegal, all of that stuff. It's a loophole they're using. I think they can't even deny that. So, okay, there's another argument, and this is an argument I've written about at length, and it'd be an interesting discussion to have, is that, okay, we understand Uber and Lyft's responsibility in terms of the lockouts, in terms of trying to game that system, so the minimum pay and all of that stuff. Couldn't there be an argument, and tell me where I'm wrong, it's almost like it's not like a statement of fact, it's like a question. When the TLC released those, whether they wanted to or not wanted to, the obviously they didn't have a discussion about it, so that's not helpful. When 10,000 FHV licenses or TLC plates were released, basically in the course of a couple of months, one could argue that yes, Uber and Lyft have a responsibility not to onboard new drivers, but if you have a green rides initiative that requires X amount of trips to be EV or wave, then obviously with the new EVs, they're going to onboard the new drivers with the EVs to meet the threshold. What is your perspective of the TLCs? And you can take this wherever you want. Doesn't the TLC share some blame in the lockouts? Is that an unfair thing of me to say?
Yeah, I think everybody shares some blame in this. But I just want to point out one thing particularly with the EVs, because it's a really important discussion, and we talk about this all the time, right? Hitting the 2030 goal and how we're going to get there. It's beyond just changing the cars, right? It's also the infrastructure that needs to be built out. But in particular with the EV plates, I think there's been a little bit of a narrative that people that are not in the industry are jumping on board to get these EV plates, when in fact it's mostly current drivers that are stuck in leasing and rental options that we're trying to get the plates so they can break out of the leasing and the rental and own the means of their own production. I forgot what the numbers were, but it was like 98% were current TLC drivers in lease and rental numbers.
If that was the case, and walk me, because I want to have a good discussion about this. If those drivers were in leasing, or let's say I know the vast majority definitely went to individuals. Now that's 100% confirmed. I still don't understand why the TLC would even allow corporations to get access to plates conceptually. Like that doesn't make any sense. It's like that doesn't even make any sense. But in any case,
so here's the issue. So underneath your question is the real problem, which is why are we limiting the number of drivers by limiting the number of plates? So the issue is there are, only so many trips to be split up among the drivers. And if you have too many drivers and not enough trips, they're not making minimum wage. And every worker in America deserves to make minimum wage, right? At least. And so when the minimum wage law was first created, which by the way was created because of a complaint that IDG filed, right? And so the whole reason there is a minimum wage in New York is because of IDG. We recommended that in order to put a cap on the number of drivers, they should limit the number of people with TLC licenses, the number of people, this is really important, with TLC licenses to be able to drive for the high volume for hire vehicles, that's the Ubers and Lyfts, okay? And what happened was the medallion owners who make money renting their vehicles said, no, you shouldn't limit the number of people, because if there's not enough people, who are we going to rent our medallions to? They said you should let there be as many people as we can cram into this industry as possible. You should limit the number of vehicles that they can drive, so some of those people have to rent our medallions. And so the TLC put the cap on vehicles, not the cap on people. This is basic economics. Whatever is scarce becomes more valuable. If you make people scarce, they're more valuable, you have to pay them more. If you make vehicles scarce, then the people have to pay more for their vehicles.
On that point, and it's a very good point. I lived in London for 5 years. So the paradigm they have in London with the black cabs, is equivalent to medallion, is the knowledge. They have this super difficult test, and they don't have a medallion, but basically it's a way to, like to your point, Andrew, a way to limit driver supply via a very difficult test. Now, I hear conceptually what you're saying makes perfect sense. It's almost like one could argue in New York City that's hard because the paradigm of the medallion existed since 1937 in terms of this limiting cars to maintain. It's one or the other, right? You either limit the cars or you limit the drivers. Like that's how you're gonna solve it.
No, that's incorrect. So it's two related but separate industries. So medallions, what a medallion gives you is the right to pick up a street hail. Okay, and if and that's a right that Uber and Lyft do not have. If you're an Uber and Lyft driver and you pick up a street hail, they are going to whack you with a fine, right? And you do that enough times, they're going to take away your license. And so if the medallion owners want to continue driving their cars or renting their cars and getting street hails, that's fine.
Sorry, I just meant in terms of the balancing supply and demand. The concept of balancing the supply and demand. To the supply in this market, the demand is the trip. So whether it's street hail or e-hails,
those are two different demands.
Those are two different demands. But what I'm saying is that you can't, via regulation, unless you raise the taxes or something, the trips are the trip. Like the demand is the demand, the market forces of demand. But like what you're saying is that, okay, instead of being a vehicle cap. And by the way, what I mean to say is that what you're saying is a valid point. You're saying instead of living in a paradigm where we have a vehicle cap, where there's a value to a plate on a hood or something, right? Or a TLC plate or something like that. You're saying, let's get rid of that, right? Let's put the value on the driver's license. Is that unfair?
That is unfair because you're mixing two different industries as one. So if the TLC wanted to, they could say anyone can get a TLC license, anyone with a TLC license can drive a yellow cab, and we're gonna put a cap on how many yellow cabs are on the road through a medallion system, and you gotta have a medallion on your hood, you can't do that. And then for high volume, for hire vehicles, that's Uber and Lyft, we're gonna have a separate system because for that group of people, we're gonna guarantee them a minimum wage. And the only way you can guarantee a minimum wage is by putting a cap on the number of drivers. And so for that industry, that's our industry, those are our workers.
Or vehicles, what they'll argue, just to be fair.
But see, that's not true. Because what happened when they did that was workers used to be willing to work for less than minimum wage. The Parrott-Reich study showed it was about $12 an hour in a city where the minimum wage at the time was $15 an hour. And so when those workers wanted to go to work and wanted to rent a vehicle, the vehicle rental agency said, aha, so we know that you're willing to work for $12 an hour. So we're going to, because we have a monopoly on these plates, we're going to charge way more than we have to lease these vehicles, because we know we can drive you all the way down to really just taking home $12 an hour. And we can take that extra $3 an hour, because when you make plates valuable, people will pay for plates. When you make people valuable, you have to pay more to the people.
Couldn't you do that? And that makes a lot of sense what you're saying. Couldn't you do, like, for example, in that city council hearing, there was a bill about lease caps. Couldn't you do, I'm not saying that's the end all be all, but as another solution, do lease caps to prevent that abuse from those leasing companies?
So sure, that's a step in the right direction. We're not against lease caps, but it's when you create a bad system, when you could create a good system, why keep trying to fix your bad system? Like, what we're trying to do is get workers more money in their pockets. The way you put more money in workers' pockets and drivers' pockets is you make the worker valuable. This is like basic supply and demand, right?
So how would that driver, it's an interesting, I really like this discussion, by the way. This is very intriguing. How would that driver, like, let's say you have, a lot of, obviously you guys know New York City is a land of immigrants. There's a lot of immigrants coming in all the time, which is beautiful, which is great. Let's say you got like, all like 50,000 new immigrants, and they were betting that, okay, we're going to join the for hire vehicle. Like, we're going to drive Uber and Lyft. And they're like, what? Like, I can't get a driver's license. Like, how would you address that?
Yeah, so this is the same argument. When the minimum wage was first created in America, certain sectors were kept out of the minimum wage. It was farm workers, domestic workers, and basically the argument was back then completely racist. It was, who would hire these black and brown people if they had to pay the same amount they paid white people? We got to make sure these black and brown people can get jobs, and if it means they earn less than minimum wage, that's what it means. And so that's what they did. That was wrong then, and it's wrong now. In order to make sure that drivers make minimum wage, whether they're immigrants or born here, I don't care. If you want to make a minimum wage, you can't have an unlimited number of drivers, because there is a limited number of trips, and that's it. And so we either say these immigrants deserve to make a minimum wage like everyone else in America, and therefore we have to put a cap on the number of workers in this industry, or we say, like they did in the racist 30s, these workers don't deserve a minimum wage because of who they are, and therefore we're going to just let them all, flood in and fight each other for a limited number of trips. I think we were wrong in the 30s. I think that attitude is wrong today. I think everybody who's working in America deserves to have at least the minimum.
So basically, like, let's say a guy comes here and he's like, month number 1, you're basically saying is welcome to America, right? You're saying welcome to America, glad to have you here. But listen, there's a whole bunch of other people who've been already working in the TLC industry. So you can apply for the license, get a license, but honestly, you got to wait in line, and there's other industries. Is that a fair way to
that work has to wait in line and maybe work in a different industry? Like it's not like immigrants, there's only one thing you can do when you come to America. It's drive for Uber, and unfortunately, now there's a wait list. Like there's other things that people can do when they come to America, and we can't say those industries should pay less than minimum wage. We can't, and we shouldn't say this industry should make less than minimum wage. And that's That's the alternative.
And just a step on that as well, you know, we don't want an industry where people immigrate to this country with the hope and dream that they're gonna reach the middle class, you know, driving around Uber and Lyfts. And when they get there, because the market is so flooded, that dream is not attainable.
Right.
So if we continue the process that we're going down, it's gonna continue to drop and continue to go lower. And, you know, I'm gonna go back to what Andrew says, right? We need to put the people, the drivers, as the commodity that's gonna make the money, that the companies are want to pay the drivers more to uplift them than rather the vehicles. And if you go to, you know, a McDonald's or a construction site, right? If there's all the positions are filled, all the positions are filled.
And the other thing too is it also will stop. I'm an immigrant as well, right? So you know, but the thing
She has more credibility than both of you. No,
Sorry,
I'm just messing around. My parents are immigrants.
My mother worked 3 jobs. I barely saw her. That's to tell you how hard she worked. But the other thing with that is that when we look at the value of a worker and a worker coming into this industry, we have to think about the sacrifices of the others that's been here. If you walk into this country today and get a driver's license to drive, you know nothing about the country, you know nothing about the lay of the land, you're still learning the language. What do you think happens? You get deactivated because the understanding isn't there. But you need to have a process to get to understand where you are before you jump in it. We've had cases where drivers came and they're barely 18, 19, and they use it as, you know, a dating pool, right? So because they're young and they don't understand, they're just making good money and beautiful girls are getting in the car. But there should be a standard. For anything that we do, there should be a standard and expectation, right? There are parts of this industry that need workers. Then before, it used to be separated by sector. They can do that. It doesn't say that you can stop giving, just not in the FHV sector. Livery needs workers, yellow needs workers. If you want to come in this industry, you can work for those sectors.
And so just to how this paradigm would look, and we'll revert back to the current lockout situation, but obviously there's like even if you instituted this policy today, it would take multiple years to kind of flow through, because I think there's like 180,000 TLC licensed drivers.
Yeah, but to support the existing minimum wage, the companies have to be around 58% utilization rate. That means about 58% of the time you have to be have a passenger car, be on your way to pick up.
Oh, no, don't get me wrong. What I'm saying is that let's say today the city council approved a license cap, like a driver's license cap, because there's 100 and correct me if I'm wrong, I think there's 180,000 TLC licensed drivers currently. So let's say you even instituted that, like, let's say like someone was able to just pass through a law, it would probably take a couple of years for that driver, because then you have those 60,000, like, because there's like 117,000 for hire vehicles, I think. So you have 117,000 for hire vehicles and 180,000 currently active TLC driver's licenses. So, you know, if you instituted that law, it's a solution. Don't get me wrong, but I don't think it's an overnight solution.
Think about this wrong. It would actually work in a matter of months. And it would be completely effective in a matter of months.
Sure. Yeah.
So the people are constantly leaving the industry or just stopping to drive. Many will maintain their TLC license just in case they want to get back into it. The question is how many people are actively driving at any time. And what you need to do is you need to have the right number of drivers so that about 58% of the time they're dealing with a passenger or on their way to get a passenger rather than just driving around waiting for their next trip. Uber is already just about at that number. Lyft is a little over 50% right now. And so the amount of time it would take to get up to 58%, given the number of drivers who are constantly leaving the industry, Uber's already there and Lyft would be there in a matter of months. Now, the way the system would work is when the utilization rate got too high, that is when you're racing around from trip to trip to trip and the passengers are waiting longer and longer for our driver, that becomes a problem for the industry, right? You don't want passengers waiting too long because then they're gonna go take a subway or do something else. And so when it gets too high, like let's say from 58 to 60%, then you start to let in more drivers. It doesn't matter what the total
So
number
this is where conceptually I agree where you're going with that. The issue becomes is that, let's say a driver's making $600 a day in that system, right? They're going to go to TLC. It's like, I'm making $600 a day. Why in the world are you letting more drivers onto the platform? You know what I'm saying? Why are you letting more drivers in the industry?
That's why the city council gets to make the decision in the law. And so, because the city council is the city council's job is to balance all the various stakeholders here, right? So the city council wants to make sure we have a well-functioning transportation system. The city council wants to make sure that workers are fairly paid. The city council wants to make sure that, people aren't getting ripped off, like all that kind of stuff. And so it all balances out to a nice, fair utilization number tied to a nice minimum wage for how much you're going to get per trip. So we're going to make sure you get enough money per trip. We're going to make sure everybody gets enough trips. We're going to make sure that the passengers aren't waiting too long. And all that is about valuing all the right things. So you want to value how long a passenger has to wait. You want to value how much they have to pay. You want to value how much the worker is getting paid. Notice none of those things is you want to value how much, giant private equity companies who are investing in fleets make off of their capital investments in vehicles. Like that's not one of the things that
we'll get back to the last topic I want to talk about is the yellow cab medallion industry, but I want to quickly revert back to what's causing the current lockouts and how to solve for that. If you could waive them, if you were given the regulatory wand to waive, how would you solve driver lockouts? Yes, we understand the driver license cap is a way to do it. Is there anything else? Let's say, okay, that's one way to do it. Is there anything else one can do to solve for the lockouts that are currently going on?
There's one thing that should have been mentioned. Now, when you limit the amount of drivers on the road, it stops Uber and Lyft from deactivating drivers, which causes more drivers to stay on the platform and working. And so the limit of lockouts would be far less because they only have a certain number of drivers to work with. So we have to look at they all coincide with each other as far as a solution.
And that's a very good point. You're basically saying that Uber and Lyft are going to think twice. They're like, oh my God, this is one of 120,000 people I can access. Like, let me triple check if I got that's a very fair point. Is there any,
if you cheapen workers, they're treated poorly.
I agree with, I think that's a very, very fair statement.
That's what
that's a very fair statement.
Our system, because of what the medallion owners wanted, because the medallion owners make money off their cars, it cheapened the worker so that they can make more money off of their vehicles. That's the problem. And we see that problem, that same problem, if you make workers cheap, they're treated like crap. And we see that in deactivations. We see that in how much they have to pay to lease cars because they can't own their own means of production. We see that in how the minimum wage is being treated with lockouts. If you're able to, if you cheapen the workers, they're treated like crap. That's the bottom line here. That's what you have to fix.
On the medallion, like, it's an interesting, I don't own a medallion, so I have no, like, I'm not like speaking for the medallion owners here. I don't have a financial interest in any tax medallion, but one could argue that the system, like to your point, yes, if we could rewrite history, there are different systems that we would change in different ways that are unideal. But what do you say to, let's say, a member of the Taxi Workers Alliance who's just he's not a massive, gigantic hedge fund company or anything like that. And they can make their own arguments, but let's focus on the individual driver who owns that taxi medallion, who bought that taxi medallion, which is a franchise, and the city raised money from the sale of the taxi medallion. So city's making money, the driver, like, let's say he's been in this industry. We're talking about, helping people who've been in the industry, right? So let's say the guy's been in the industry since 1990. What do you say to that? Are you just telling that guy that, listen, tough luck, man, like your medallion
No,
is
of
zero.
course not. Of course not. The city has done those men and women dirty, and the city needs to fix that. The way to fix that is not by saying, okay, we're gonna take this other immigrant community and we're gonna screw them rather than screwing these medallion owners. That's not your solution. So the taxi worker, the Taxi Worker Alliance, the medallion owners, the Taxi Workers Alliance, are excellent advocates for medallion owners. You I'm sure remember the hunger strike they held to lower the debt on medallions, for example. Those are the kinds of actions that need to be done to support that immigrant workforce that got screwed by this city, and they need to be that needs to be addressed, and justice needs to be done there. But you don't do justice for that workforce by screwing another workforce. That's not the answer to this problem.
Is a fair way to say this, and I think, by the way, I think that might make you some friends over there. Be careful. But
But they're not our enemy.
Right.
Like the fact.
no, it's good to hear. I'm half joking, but I think it's good to hear that, because I think sometimes what happens is driver versus driver type of stuff going on, and I think that's just bad. I think sometimes that happens, and a little bit of that is going on. But do you think, as a concept, the taxi medallion, let me rephrase it. You're saying taxi medallion can exist but for street hails, which might be 10 or 15% of the market in perpetuity. Maybe, is that the way you're approaching it? Like, yes, there can be a taxi medallion, but it's a street hail thing.
Yeah, we don't want to wipe out medallions. I mean, that's.
Yeah, I mean, they're part of the public transportation system,
Yeah.
right? Especially in New York City.
I think a lot of people will be very interested to hear this take from you guys, that
We
Yeah.
just
you
don't
see
want to
a place for
all
medallion.
workers to rent from you. Like, let the medallion owners compete. So if they're leasing their vehicles at a rate that's profitable for drivers, they'll get drivers. And if they're not, they shouldn't be fighting. They shouldn't be doing things like limiting the number of EV license plates because then drivers are going to have to rent from somebody, or putting in Intro 276 so that we can make more workers who can't work for Uber and Lyft, and so they'll have to rent from us. Like, that's not how we should.
Many of them will say, and we've had them on, and this is a very healthy discussion to have, and they'll say that, wait, hold up, like, yes, what he's saying right now is good, but Uber flooded the market, Uber messed up the market, and now we are left to recover this. That's them. I'm giving their argument, their straw man, right? And how they might view it is that there was a limit before. All of these things, it was existing law that was blown up, and we're just asking for the existing regime to come back into place. But what you're saying, and I'll let you respond to this too, you're saying that just because an existing regime existed doesn't mean that that was the right regime.
I'm saying a transition has happened in America, and those individuals. Some of those individuals got hurt unfairly, and we need to, as a society, address that. The way to address that is not to say, okay, we're going to immiserate this other group so that you can make money. Like, that's not what we should be doing. Like, the city and the state screwed up when Uber came here illegally, and later the laws caught up to what Uber and Lyft were doing, and so on, and an unintended or possibly intended from Uber and Lyft, consequence of that was to punish the people who had invested in those medallions to serve the people of New York. And those people need rescuing. And there are ways to do that. And we saw that with like the debt, the help with the medallion debts, right? So they didn't say, okay, we're gonna go to low-income Uber and Lyft drivers, and we're gonna take money out of their pockets, and we're gonna put the money into the pockets of the medallion owners. They said, as a society, we've made a mistake, we need to fix that mistake, and we all had to address that, right? That's the answer to this problem, not take our workers and make them miserable.
And getting to now, that's very well put. Getting now to back to lockouts, and I know we have about 15 minutes left if you have it, is that so in order to solve lockouts, so Andrew, what you said, and I know you said it in public hearings, limit the driver's license. And then inherently, Michelle, what you're saying is if you limit the driver's license, that also has the impact that Uber and Lyft which makes total conceptual sense, will think like, okay, before I deactivate driver one of 120,000, whatever the driver's name is, let me think about this. Is there anything else that can be done to limit the lockouts, or do you think,
That's the best answer.
that's the best answer?
It's the best, like everything else is you're just like, you're trying to like, okay, we've built this, terrible structure and now we're gonna try and duct tape it. So it's leaning this way. Let's try and get it leaning, like, forget it. Like the whole point of the minimum wage law is to fairly value workers. The way you do that is you make workers scarce, not cars scarce.
And do you agree with the the utilization rate, as a concept in the minimum wage formula?
Absolutely. Yep. That's how you have to do it.
Got it. Okay. Okay. And then the last thing I'll say in terms of,
So real quick on the utilization rate, we have seen other areas where they've implemented minimum pay without any utilization, and the drivers don't end up making more money.
Right. It doesn't work.
It just doesn't work. They end up sitting in the cars longer, and they may break even as to where they were at, but they're not making more money because there's nothing tied to utilization.
I wrote about 2 points where this is like it's kind of circular, because if you limit, whether it's the drivers, and obviously the current paradigm is more vehicles, utilization should take care of itself, hopefully. So you don't need that formula conceptually.
You tie it together. You say, this is our target utilization rate. Look, the issue is
exactly manage the supply.
You gotta pay enough during the trip. The way in minimum wage works is you pay enough during the trip so that it also pays for the wait time, right? So Uber will try to make this look funny. So in Massachusetts, they're saying, oh, we pay $32 an hour. That's crap, because like the drivers are sitting around waiting half the time. And so you're really paying half of $32 an hour, because half the time you're waiting for your next trip, right? And so you've got to make sure you pay enough during the trip so it pays for the time when you're waiting for your next trip. How long you're waiting is what determines how much you get to bring home at the end of the week. And so what you want to do is you want to have enough drivers. So first you set the rate, and you can set the rate anywhere you want to. There's no magic about 58%. You could say it's 50% or 40% or 80%. The issue is at 58%, which is where we set it in New York City, passengers don't wait too long. So if you set it at like 90%, it means passengers are standing around waiting a long time for a driver to be free. And if you set it at 20%, it means that there's tons of drivers driving around all the time, and so you have to make the trip super expensive to pay for them all.
Here's another technical point, and I argued this in an article. So as you guys know, the threshold this law for our readers only applies to bases that have more than 10,000 trips. So which is only Uber. I know you guys know this, but for our listeners, so one of the points I brought up in an article was like that threshold shouldn't be set so low, because let's say you have a rival, like a new rideshare company come into the market and they get 2.5% market share, and then all of a sudden they're under the same minimum pay. Do you see a way to elevate that?
What we're trying to do solves that problem, because we want the utilization rate to be for the whole industry. And so it's one utilization rate for the whole industry. So if you're new to the industry, you may only be giving an individual driver 1 trip a day. And so the utilization rate for your company is really, really low. But that's okay, because for the whole industry, it's still 58%. And then new entrants can enter the market, can compete against Uber and Lyft. And if they can do a better job, if they're treating workers better and they're attracting more drivers and so on, then they'll grow. And that's exactly what we want. We want that kind of competition. And so the TLC has set one standard for the industry for how much you have to pay per trip, but hasn't set one utilization rate for the whole industry, and that's a mistake.
That's a super. I think I 100% agree with that. I think because like you were saying, we have a separate system for yellow cabs, and there's actually a third system where there's yellow cabs, there's high volume bases, and then there's like non-high volume black car bases. And what you're saying right now, Andrew, and correct me if I'm wrong, is saying like, let's actually collapse that high volume versus non-high volume black car base.
Just make it easy for people to make the leap. So at 10,000 trips a day, your utilization rate is either going to be really low, or you're going to have so few drivers that your passengers are going to have to wait 40 minutes for a car to get to them. And that means that that new company, let's call
They'll
it.
go out of business immediately after it passes the
Exactly.
10,000
So like
trips.
if you want to have Dawood, app, and you want to start competing against Uber and Lyft, you've got this chicken and egg problem. You got to get enough drivers driving for you that you can service a passenger when somebody in, Sunnyside hits and says, I want a driver. Someone's got to be close by, right? And then the next one's up in the Bronx and someone has to be close by. So you need enough drivers on your system, but at the same time, you don't have enough passengers on your system to attract all those drivers. And so the way this should work is there's one giant pool of drivers that has multiple apps running. And then some new entrant can say, okay, I got Uber, I got Lyft, and now I got Dawood. And then passengers could be like, oh, this is the better one of those three. And there's going to be like the same drivers are going to be everywhere.
So are you calling for like an aggregation app of some sort?
No. I mean, it could be separate. You could be running separate phones and separate apps or whatever, but a driver.
Oh, got it. Okay.
Typically what happens today anyway with Uber and Lyft. But Uber and Lyft are big enough that they're big enough in the industry that they've reached those utilization rates, or in Lyft's case, close. But some new entrant would go out of business long before they ever got up to 58%.
What happened to Jazz, you guys? That's exactly what happened to Juno. That's exactly why they went out of business.
I drove for Juno.
And that's
we
not
like
good for,
Juno.
right, and that's not good. That's not good for anyone. So real competition is good for passengers. It's good for drivers. Like, we want there to be real competition in New York, and the way you do that is you say the TLC's job is to regulate the pool of drivers, and then the companies get to fight for who in that pool is driving for their trips. Right, and so that again, you want to make the drivers.
It kind of goes back to the first principles of the issue, which is supply and demand, and
exactly. This isn't that complicated. Like, right, if you if you took economics in high school, you could figure out how to do this. So
to kind of we're reaching almost the hour, and I think a lot of people are going to watch this, but to kind of conclude the podcast, and by the way, guys, thank you this is a really cool discussion, and I really enjoyed it. I hope you guys did too. For the yellow cab industry, and I want to conclude it with what you have said is that there's space for yellow cabs, there's space for Uber and Lyft or black car base or luxury limo. There's a role for everyone here.
Yes.
And you're saying is that sometimes I'm not going to say what you're saying. Sometimes how I perceive it is that almost by definition, it's in a person's nature to be zero sum about what they're going to lobby for. So if you are a medallion owner, right, you're going to lobby meaning you're going to advocate for maximum benefit for the yellow cab industry. Now, obviously, if you're not a medallion owner, you'll be like, well, that guy owns a medallion, or that woman owns a medallion, or that hedge fund owns a medallion, and they're obviously conflicted. What they'll say is, yes, we are conflicted, but that's what we own, and we're gonna, lobby the heck out of that. So my question to you is that while you disagree with them, you're saying that, listen, we're not trying to crush you. We're saying it doesn't have to be so zero sum. It's not like you win, I lose. And sometimes you're feeling like some of their advocacy is zero sum advocacy, where in order for you to win, we must lose. Is that a fair way to frame it, or am I not framing that correct?
So a couple of things. First of all, I want to make clear who we're talking about here, right? So landlords rent apartments to tenants. Some landlords live in the building too, right? And they're still landlords. And so medallion owners rent medallions to drivers. Some of them also drive their cars sometimes, but they rent their cars to drivers. Landlords don't advocate for tenant rights and shouldn't pretend they advocate for tenant rights. Medallion owners don't advocate for driver rights and shouldn't pretend they advocate for driver rights. Now, there are some times where we have things in common. Landlords want clean parks in the neighborhood, tenants want clean parks in the neighborhood, right? There's lots of places where we have things in common. Sometimes what helps one hurts the other, right? So to the extent that a driver makes more money driving for Uber and Lyft, they're going to be less likely to want to pay $165 for 12 hours of a yellow cab. So sometimes we conflict with each other, and that's fine. Like that's how markets work. That's how government works, is different interests fight for their interests. The thing that bothers me is not that, oh, they're going zero sum, whatever, is that they're claiming to do it in the name of the driver. So like, we're gonna make it harder for you to get back on Uber and Lyft, and we're doing that, and it's for your benefit somehow. Or we're gonna make it so that you have to keep renting a vehicle and you can't own your own vehicle, and really we're doing this for you. And like, just be honest about it. Like, you know, you wanna help medallion owners, help medallion owners. Medallion owners deserve to have a good trade association, and they do, they have a good trade association. It's called the New York Taxi Workers Alliance. And they should be proud of the work they do helping medallion owners. We represent drivers, and we're proud of the work we do representing drivers. And when we can work together to make the parks cleaner, or whatever is the thing that helps both of us, we should do that. And when sometimes we're, you know, there are some things that are zero sum, let's just be clear about it.
That's a very fair way to put it. I mean, in many ways, like that hedge, like if we're talking about Marblegate, for example, what they'll say, their argument, I'm not speaking for them, but I come from the world of finance. They'll say that, listen, this medallion industry was dead. If it wasn't for us and our money, that would have affected drivers' lives. More suicides would have occurred. They forgave a lot of debt. They agreed to the debt restructuring. After doing all of that, you know, we're going to lobby for our rights as you want to define it as landlords 100%. Sometimes they're actually like the lender of the medallion, where they're giving the loan for a driver. So it's kind of like a bank
With the mortgage,
relationship kind of thing. But you're basically saying is like your main issue, and I think I appreciate this honesty from you guys. Your main issue is that whatever you're advocating for, like, just be straight about it. Like, don't say that, oh, I'm advocating for this, when it's clearly like, well, how are you advocating for an Uber driver if what you're advocating for is directly not benefiting them? And so I think a place that you've carved a very influential place, is that you're born of this new paradigm of Uber and Lyft and the gig economy. And my guess is that gig workers, whether in Uber or Lyft or wherever, is only going to grow bigger, like that, group of people. And so I guess I'll leave it to you for any final thoughts, but I definitely want to get into how do people find IDG, where your office is at, but I'll give you guys the last words for anything.
End where we begin, and I'll hand over to you, because I know you want to do that.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so I want to end where I began. This is why you need unions. This is why we were created, because you need unions. The boss doesn't represent the workers. The medallion owners don't represent the drivers. Workers' lives get better when they're in a union. They get worse when they're not. That's what we've seen all through American history, right? And so these workers need a union. IDG was created to find ways to organize these workers, better their lives, and in the end, ultimately, find ways to get them into a union so they can fight for their interests, just like the medallion owners have a association that fights for their interests. And you know, no union says that, you know, the bosses shouldn't have their association. Let them have their association. We want our association. Our association is a union. That's what workers have. They have unions.
Yeah, thank you, Andrew. You know, as you asked this question very early on, and I don't think we answered it, you know, about IDG and where we sit in the world. You know, we were formed here in New York City with New York City drivers, and we kind of lived, you know, Andrew, I think you said it, we were kind of a think tank for the machinists. We were a living think tank, right? We were putting policies into place. We were, you know, on the streets. We're trying to figure this out as we were going along and develop policies to go along with that, and, you know, make it a state by state national policies that we're doing. And you know, we mentioned the work up in Massachusetts that the unions are doing to replicate some of the things that we've done here in New York City. And that's really the goal, is, you know, while we're in the streets in New York City, our long-term thinking is, how do we lift this industry into a middle-class job across the country? And that's what our main big focus is how do we do what we've done here so successfully in New York City and take this from state to state across the country, uplifting all the drivers around. And you know, in particular, you know, there aren't big medallion owner associations in other states, which makes it a little bit different than what we're dealing here in New York City.
So what states are we in?
Now you're gonna make me count.
All right, Florida.
Massachusetts. No, not Massachusetts. I'm sorry. Where are we? Connecticut. New
In all
Jersey.
the nice states where you can vacation, right? No.
Right. Rhode Island.
Rhode Island, Florida, Pennsylvania, Illinois.
Illinois. I think that's it.
But this started in New York City though, right? This is where it started.
Right.
Actually, I am one of the original workers, so I've been there.
You're an OG. You're an
almost-
OG
I
in
am a
IDG.
real OG. I've been there, so I've been through every
You're
struggle.
number 3, right?
I'm number 3 out of who.
Number
did-
3. Wow. Okay. Wow.
And
Okay.
so why I say that it's a personal insult to us is because we are drivers and we take everything that we do personally because we know how it affects a driver. And so we always want to be careful. And that's where our biggest fight is, the fact that the voice should always be the worker. And that's what IDG is. The voice has always been from the worker's perspective.
I'll say one quick, just to, and this is a point of support where, I have my own views, NYTWA has their own views, everybody has their own views. Obviously, it's a democracy and no one's going to agree 100%. That'd be insane, right? But I think organizations like yours are tremendous is if you have 10,000 or 20,000 or whatever members there are, they've obviously given you their voice. They have come to you to give them a voice, and that I take very seriously. So if 20,000 people come to IDG and says, oh, these predatory leasing companies or these medallion or whatever, right? Whether I agree or disagree, if 20,000 people are saying it, right? If that's a perspective or even more than that, then that voice does need to be heard. It needs to be elevated. And so I think in that regards, you guys have done an incredible job coming from New York City, going to all the different states. And, thanks for coming, talking to me and going through these stuff. I'm sure Andrew or Michelle or Brendan, I'll see you guys at public hearings and stuff like that. But this was great. This was great. As a last point, how does someone find IDG? Like, I'll provide a link to the description, or like if someone wants to join IDG, how do they do that?
So they can go, number one, first and foremost, for the deactivation, I am deactivated.com. And we just go online, the Independent Drivers Guild, and we visit driversguild.org.
And we have a tremendous amount of walk-ins too. We're in Sunnyside, Queens, 4109 36th Street, on the 3rd floor. Our doors are always open, so we have drivers coming in and out. We have coffee and snacks for drivers that just want to take a break, bathroom. We have a prayer room if drivers need to just jump in for a quick prayer. And of course, we offer all the TLC classes and the DDC6 classes and our mental health program, and sign you up for benefits and everything. But our doors are always open.
Great. And we'll provide a link to the location and description and everything. So guys, thank you very much for your time, and hopefully we'll do this again soon.
Yeah, thank
Yeah,
you.
thank you
Appreciate
very
it.
much.
Okay.